The first time anyone in Grover Mill saw Hester Dodd after she vanished, it was 6 years later, and she was selling butter. Not just any butter. Pale gold, sweet cream butter, wrapped in cheesecloth and packed in a pine crate, carried down the mountain on the back of a mule nobody recognized. She set it on the counter of Orson Tate's general store without a word. When Tate unwrapped it, the smell alone stopped two women mid-conversation by the dry goods shelf. It was the finest butter anyone in that valley had tasted in years, maybe ever. Tate looked up from the crate. He looked at the old woman standing across the counter from him. White-haired, sun-darkened, wind-scoured, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same Virginia hardwood as the mountains behind her. She was leaning slightly on her left side the way a person does when one knee has stopped being entirely reliable. She was watching him with calm, dark eyes that didn't blink much. He knew those eyes. "Hester Dodd," he said. The name came out slow, like he was testing whether it still fit. "Lord Almighty, people thought you were dead." She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just looked at him the way a mountain looks at weather. "I know," she said. "Let them think it a little longer." Then she told him what she wanted in trade: flower coffee nails and a bolt of canvas. He gave her all above it without argument. When she walked out the door, he stood at the window and watched her load the mule with the unhurried precision of someone who had not wasted a single motion in a very long time. The dog walked beside her, big black as chimney soot, with amber eyes that caught the March light like two coins. The mole followed without being led. Tate watched until the road bent and the trees took them. Then he sat down on a barrel behind the counter and didn't move for a long time. To understand what Hester built in those mountains, you have to understand what was taken from her first. And to understand what was taken, you have to understand the woman she was before the taking. Hester Dodd was 63 years old in the spring of 1909. She had been married to Clement Dodd for 31 years, and in that time, they had built something together that people in the Shenandoah foothills called a good life. Not a rich life, not an easy life, but a real one with roots that went down deep. The farm sat on 180 acres of rolling land on the eastern edge of the Grover Mill Valley. There was a creek that ran cold and clear through the lower pasture, fed from a spring higher up in the ridge. In a country where water was the difference between a working farm and a gravel pit, that creek was worth more than the land around it. Clem had known it when his father homesteaded the place. Hester had known it every morning for 30 years when she carried the first bucket to the garden before the sun was fully up. The garden was hers. Not legally, not on any paper that mattered in 1909, but in every practical sense, that garden belonged to Hester the way a song belongs to the person who learned to sing it by heart. She had worked it since the year she and Clem married. She had turned hard clay into something that yielded. She had composted and amended and rotated and tested. She had kept a notebook, a thick cloth-covered a journal that she filled slowly over the years, with observations so detailed and methodical, they would have embarrassed most men who called themselves farmers. What grew in what soil? What failed and why? How to read a hillside for drainage by the color of the clay at the surface? How to build a root cellar that stayed above freezing through a Virginia winter? How to coax productivity from ground that looked like it had given up? She had learned some of it from watching Clem's mother, old Maud, who had gardened that same land for 40 years before her knees went. The rest she had figured out herself, season by season, failure by failure, the way knowledge actually gets built by people who are paying attention. Clem was a good man, a steady man. He was not a complicated man, which was something Hester had always considered a quiet blessing. He worked hard, kept his word, and never once tried to tell Hester how to run her garden. He also, in the last years of his life, developed a stubbornness about his health that she could never quite argue him out of. The cough started in the summer of 1908. Clem called it dust. Then he called it the dry air. Then he stopped calling it anything and just worked through it, which was the Dodd way of handling problems, and which worked fine for fence posts and soil amendments, and not at all for a sickness that had settled into his lungs and intended to stay. By October, he was sleeping propped up on 2 pillows. By December, he couldn't walk to the barn without stopping to rest. Hester sat beside him through the worst nights, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, listening to the terrible work his chest was doing just to move air in and out. She had seen enough sickness in 63 years to know the difference between a man fighting something he would eventually beat and a man fighting something that had already decided the outcome. Clem died on a Tuesday morning in February 1909 with pale winter light coming through the bedroom window and Hester's hand holding his. She buried him on the ridge above the south pasture in ground that had been in his family for 2 generations. She did it herself with help from their neighbor Birch Geary's hired hand because Birch himself was busy with calving season and sent his regrets through the boy instead of delivering them in person. She noted that. She noted most things. 2 days after the funeral, going through Clem's papers in the tin box under the bedroom floorboards, she found the note. $350, borrowed from Pruitt and Sons Bank in Grover Mill the previous spring to buy a new bull and repair the east fence line. The note was written in the careful formal language that banks use when they want something to be impossible to misunderstand. Principal and interest due in full within 60 days of the borrower's death or by January 1st of the following year, whichever came first. Clem had died in February. The 60-day clock was already running. Hester sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with that piece of paper in her hands. She had $11.40 in the house. She had livestock, but not enough to sell at winter prices and cover $350 after 60 days of feeding and care. She had land and a house and a garden that wouldn't produce anything until April at the earliest. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had not panicked when the creek flooded the lower pasture in 1897. She had not panicked when the blight took half the kitchen garden in 1903. She was by nature, and by 30 years of farming, a woman who looked at a problem from all sides before she decided how to approach it. She looked at this problem from all sides. Then she put on her good coat and rode into Grover Mill to see Orville Pruitt. Pruitt and Sons Bank occupied the most solid building on the main street of Grover Mill. Brick front, polished oak counter, the particular stillness of a place where money lives. Orville Pruitt was a thin man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, patient manner of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that it no longer costs him anything personally. He listened to Hester with complete attention. He did not interrupt. When she finished presenting her case, the livestock she could sell in spring, the garden production she could commit against the debt, the reasonable request for a 6-month extension, he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and regarded her with something that looked almost like sympathy. Almost. The note was clear, he explained. The terms had been agreed to by her husband. The bank had its own obligations to its depositors. An extension was not something the note allowed for. Partial payments were not something the note allowed for. He truly sympathized. He hoped she understood. Hester understood. She understood that Orville Pruitt had been having variations of this conversation for years, and that the outcome was always the same, and that his sympathy was the kind that costs a man nothing and changes nothing and exists only to make him feel better about what he's doing. She asked if there was any other arrangement possible. There was not. She asked who she could appeal to above Pruitt. He told her without any particular expression that he was the final authority on the matter. She thanked him for his time and walked out. She was on the boardwalk outside, pulling her coat tighter against the February cold, when she heard the voices through the partially open window of Pruitt's side office. She was not trying to listen. She was simply there, and the wind was still, and the voices carried. Pruitt's voice first, lower than the tone he'd used with her, more relaxed. The voice of a man speaking to someone he didn't need to perform for. The Dodd woman came in today. A second voice, heavier, a voice she recognized though she couldn't immediately place it. And same as the others, wants an extension, has a plan. A pause. She doesn't have $350. 60 days. 60 days, maybe less if she tries to fight it. The second voice again. Closer to the window now, like the man had stood up and moved. That creek on the Dodd land is the only reliable water source in the Eastern Valley. You understand what that's worth to the right buyer. A silence, then Pruitt, I understand exactly what it's worth. Then we're agreed. Hester stood very still on the boardwalk. The cold was significant. She did not feel it. She recognized the second voice now. It belonged to Sheriff Dex Morrow. She walked to where Drum was tied at the post, untied him, and rode home without stopping. She did not think about what she had heard in the way of someone processing a shock. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, methodically from all sides, following each implication to its end. 3 other families had lost land in the Eastern Valley in the past 2 years. the Henley place, the Briggs homestead, the old Wicker farm. She had heard about each of them, noted each of them, and filed them in the back of her mind as separate misfortunes, hard times, bad luck. The kind of thing that happened to people who got overextended. They were not separate misfortunes. They were a pattern, and she was the next point in it. That evening alone in the house that smelled still of Clem's pipe tobacco and the particular sadness of recently vacated rooms, Hester sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her and thought about what she knew and what she could do. What she knew: the debt was real, the deadline was real, and the system that was going to enforce it had already decided the outcome. There was no appeal to be made to Pruitt. There was no appeal to be made to Morrow. The county judge was a man who had dinner with Morrow on the second Thursday of every month. The territorial law did not in 1909 in the Commonwealth of Virginia offer a widow much in the way of protection from a properly filed banknote. What she could do: fight a battle she had already lost, or choose a different terrain entirely. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, the February wind moved through the bare trees on the ridge, and the house settled around her with its small sounds, and somewhere in the dark past the kitchen window, the creek she had carried water from for 30 years kept running. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write. The 60 days ran out on April 11th. Orville Pruitt filed the petition with the county clerk on April 12th. Sheriff Dex Morrow rode out to the Dodd farm on the morning of April 14th with 2 deputies and a folded piece of paper that had been signed by the circuit court judge and stamped with the county seal. It was a clear morning. Cold still, the way blue ridge mornings stay cold well into spring, but with the light that comes in April that has a different quality than any other month. Sharper, more particular. The kind of light that makes you see things exactly as they are. Morrow was not a physically imposing man, but he carried himself like one. He had the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his own territory. He was 54 years old, and he had been the sheriff of this county for 16 years, and in that time he had ridden out on similar errands enough times that the unpleasantness had been worn smooth by repetition. He found Hester in the garden, not crying, not packing, kneeling in the turned earth of the kitchen beds with her hands in the soil the way she did every morning when the ground was workable. She looked up when the horses came into the yard. She stood, brushed the soil from her hands, waited. Morrow dismounted. He was correct and formal, and not unkind in the way that men are sometimes not unkind when doing something they've decided is simply the way of things. He explained the situation as if she might not already understand it perfectly. The debt had not been satisfied. The court had authorized seizure of the property. She had 48 hours to vacate the premises. She could take personal belongings. She could take horse, the livestock, the outbuildings, the tools, the fencing, the land, the creek, everything reverted to the bank. A woman your age alone out here, Morrow said, not cruelly, but with the thoughtless authority of a man who has never once questioned whether his assessments of other people's lives are any of his business. You do better to go to family. There are people in this county who'd see you settled somewhere comfortable. Hester looked at him for a long moment. The light was behind him, and she had to shade her eyes slightly, and something about the gesture, the deliberateness of it, the calm, seemed to make him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't have named. "I'll remember you said that," she told him. That was all. She turned and walked back to the house, and neither Morrow nor his deputies said anything else. The auction was held 3 weeks later. There was one bidder, a land speculator from the Shenandoah Valley named Prentice Vale, who happened to be Orville Pruitt's cousin by marriage. He paid a price that was insultingly precise in its relationship to the debt owed, and not a penny more. By then, Hester was already gone. She left before dawn on April 15th. The temperature was 8 degrees above zero, and a thin crust of late frost had stiffened the grass in the yard. She had spent the previous 2 days doing what needed to be done, not packing in the way of someone overwhelmed by choices, but selecting with the quiet precision of someone who has thought carefully about what survival actually requires. What she took: a bedroll, a cast iron skillet that had been on that farm for 20 years and was as well seasoned as old wood, a canvas sack of cornmeal, salt, dried venison she had put up herself the previous fall, a skinning knife and a short-handled axe, a pouch of seeds sealed in oilcloth vegetable seed she had saved herself, selected over years for the specific conditions of mountain soil and short-growing seasons. and the notebook. The thick cloth-covered journal with 30 years of accumulated knowledge written in her own hand, in her own shorthand in ink that had faded in some places but remained completely legible to the person who had written it. She considered the Bible on the bedroom shelf. She had not opened it in years. She took it anyway for reasons she didn't examine too closely. Drum was in the barn. He was 11 years old, stout and calm, with the particular patience of a horse that has spent a decade being handled by someone who never wasted his time. She saddled him by lantern light, talking to him quietly the way she always had, telling him in a low voice what they were doing and where they were going, which was something she had always done without thinking too much about whether it made sense. She led him out of the barn and into the dark yard. Soot was sitting by the gate. The dog had appeared at the farm 2 weeks after Clem died. Black as cold iron, built broad through the chest with those amber eyes that seemed to take in more than a dog's eyes usually do. He had simply arrived one evening and sat down outside the kitchen door and was still there in the morning. Hester had not asked where he came from. She had given him jerky and water, and he had accepted both without excessive gratitude, and they had arrived at an arrangement that asked nothing of either of them except presence. He sat by the gate now as if he had known, as if he had been informed of the schedule and approved of it. She opened the gate. Soot walked through first. Drum followed. Hester pulled the gate closed behind her and did not look back at the house. They went north following the creek for the first mile, then cutting west toward the higher ridgeline where the tree cover thickened. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a cold gray spreading over the dark edge of the mountains. The frost crunched under Drum's hooves. Soot moved ahead of them in silence, stopping occasionally to check the air, then moving on. Nobody followed them. Nobody came to the fence line and called her name. Nobody sent a rider to see which direction she had taken. That was the thing about being a 63-year-old widow in 1909. When you disappeared, people assumed they already understood what had happened to you. They assumed the cold or the isolation or the weight of grief and circumstance. They assumed the story had ended in the way such stories were supposed to end. They did not consider that the story might be just beginning. She was 2 days into the mountains when the full weight of what she had done arrived. Not doubt exactly, not regret, something more specific and more honest than either of those things. The understanding that she had stepped off the edge of everything familiar and that the ground she was standing on now was entirely her own and that there was no version of what came next that did not require everything she had. Her left knee ached in the cold with a persistence that was becoming difficult to think around. The cornmeal mush she made each evening over a small fire was keeping her functional, but not much more than that. Drum was steady and uncomplaining, but she could see him losing weight against the work of the rough terrain, and she rationed his grain, carefully watching him each morning, the way she had watched her garden, looking for the signs that something needed to change before the change announced itself in catastrophe. Soot hunted for himself, rabbits mostly. He would disappear for an hour and return with evidence of his success, or without it, and either way he would settle himself near the fire in the evenings and sleep with one ear raised, monitoring the dark. He never barked. Not once. It was as if he understood, in whatever way animals understand the essential facts of a situation, that silence was the price of safety out here. On the fourth night, camped in the lee of a granite outcropping, with a fire small enough to be invisible. Past 30 yards, Hester opened the notebook. She didn't read it systematically. She knew most of it already, the way you know a book you have written yourself, not word for word, but in its shape, its concerns, the way one section leads to another. She turned the pages slowly, reading by firelight, and she found herself reading not for information, but for company, for the sound of her own thinking from better days. There was a page near the middle that she had written in the fall of 1901, after a wet spring had nearly rotted the entire kitchen garden, and she had spent the summer rebuilding the drainage and amending the soil and thinking hard about what she had done wrong and what the land itself had been trying to tell her. She had written water as the argument the land is always making. Listen to where it goes. Work with what it tells you. Ground near warm water is ground that stays alive. Find where warm water meets cold rock, and you will find the last place that winter gives up. She read that passage twice. Then she sat for a long time looking at the fire, thinking about warm water, about where warm water came from, about what a person might be able to do with ground that didn't freeze. The notebook had been written by a woman trying to understand one particular piece of Virginia farmland. But the principles in it, the actual thinking, the underlying logic, those were not specific to any one place. They were observations about how things worked, about soil and water and heat and cold, and the patient business of coaxing life from difficult ground. She turned to a fresh page and began to write again. Not notes about the past, notes about what she was looking for, what conditions she needed, what she would do when she found them. She was 63 years old and she had 8 days of food and a bad knee and no claim on any land that any court would recognize. She was writing in a notebook by firelight while a black dog slept beside her in the Virginia mountains. She wrote for an hour. Then she closed the notebook, banked the fire, and went to sleep. She had work to do in the morning. She found the valley on the 10th day, not because she was looking in the right place, because Soot was. The dog had been ranging wider each morning, disappearing into the tree line for longer stretches, always returning. But on the morning of the 10th day, he went upstream along a tributary creek so narrow it barely deserved the name, and he didn't come back. Hester waited 20 minutes, then followed. The creek climbed through a tangle of rhododendron and bare alder, the water running fast and shallow over dark stone. Drum picked his way carefully, his breath coming in white clouds in the cold air. The terrain was closing in on both sides, the granite walls rising as the creek bed narrowed, and Hester had the thought that this was the kind of place that ended in a box canyon and nothing else. Then she smelled it. Not wood smoke, not animals. Something mineral and warm the way a stone smells when it has been sitting in sun all afternoon, except there was no sun here, and the temperature was well below freezing. A wet warmth rising, she came around a bend in the creek and stopped. The valley opened before her like a secret that the mountain had been keeping for a long time. It ran roughly east to west, cut deep into the granite, flanked by walls that rose 200 feet on either side. The western end was choked with a tumble of boulders that from any distance looked exactly like a natural rockfall. The eastern end terminated in a sheer face of dark stone from which at the base water emerged from a fissure in a steady steaming flow. 52 degree. She would measure it later with the small thermometer she kept in her coat pocket, the one she had carried for years to test soil temperature before planting. 52 degrees flowing year-round from deep in the rock, warm enough to steam an air that was currently sitting at 12 above zero. The valley floor was perhaps 200 yards wide at its broadest. The creek ran through the center, fed by the warm spring and by snowmelt from above. Along the base of the southern wall, where the warm water ran closest to the rock face and the stone had been absorbing whatever thin winter sun reached the valley floor, the soil was soft. Not merely thawed, genuinely soft, the way soil gets in late April in the lower valley. Soot was sitting in the center of it all with his amber eyes on her patient as a man who has been waiting for someone to catch up. Hester dismounted. She handed Drum's reins over a low branch and walked to the base of the southern wall. She knelt down and pressed both hands flat against the earth. Warm. Not dramatically, not like standing over a fire, but unmistakably, genuinely warm. The kind of warm that meant the ground beneath her palms had not frozen since the last time it was worked, if it had ever frozen at all. She stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dirt of a hidden valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains with her hands pressed to the earth, 63 years old, 8 days from anything she had ever called home. The sound of the spring filled the space around her, and above the granite walls, the February sky was a hard, clean blue. She did not feel relief. She felt something more specific than that. She felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has been working a problem for a long time and has just found the piece that makes the rest of it solvable. She stood. She pulled out the notebook. She began to write. The first shelter was not worthy of the name. 4 poles leaned against the southern wall with a canvas sheet stretched between them and weighted at the base with stones. It kept the wind off. It kept the worst of the snow off. It kept her alive, which was the only standard that mattered in February at 4,000 feet. The first weeks were an education in humility. Her knee, which had been manageable on the trail, became genuinely difficult in the cold of the valley floor. The constant kneeling and crouching and rising that the work required extracted a price each day that accumulated faster than she could pay it. She wrapped it every morning with strips of canvas and worked through the stiffness with a deliberateness that left no room for self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury that had a very specific cost out here, and she had already calculated that she could not afford it. The cold was different at this elevation than it had been on the farm. It had a weight to it, a physicality. It pressed against the canvas shelter at night with what felt like intention, and Hester slept in every layer she owned with drums standing close enough on her left that she could feel his body heat through the canvas, and so it pressed against her back on her right, a furnace of black fur that was worth more than any blanket she had brought. She ate carefully, cornmeal twice a day with dried venison when she allowed herself rationing against the unknown length of what was ahead. She lost weight she couldn't easily afford to lose. Her hands cracked in the cold until the knuckles bled, and she packed the cracks with rendered fat from the rabbit Soot brought her on the fifth day, and they healed enough to work and cracked again, and she packed them again, and this became simply the condition of her hands. The nights were the hardest part, not because of the physical discomfort, though that was real, but because the dark came early and completely in that narrow valley, the walls cutting off the last light before 5 in the afternoon, and in the dark there was nothing between Hester and the full weight of what she was doing and what it meant. She had left everything. There was no going back to anything recognizable. The farm was gone. The life she had built with Clem over 31 years was gone. The community of Grover Mill, whatever it had meant, however limited its warmth had actually been, was gone. She was a 63-year-old woman alone in the mountains in February, and if something went wrong, if she broke the bad knee, or drummed through a shoe and went lame, or the food ran out before spring made the land productive, there was no one coming. She knew that. She sat with it honestly in the dark each night, and she did not dress it up into something more manageable than it was. And then she picked up the notebook and read by the small light of the fire, and she let the work of thinking carry her forward the way it always had. There was a page she returned to repeatedly in those first weeks, a page she had written in 1904 after a conversation with old Maud Dodd Clem's mother 3 months before Maud's mind began to slip away for good. Maud had been describing a kitchen garden she'd tended as a girl in Kentucky on land that everyone said was too cold to grow much of anything, and the woman who had tended it before her, who had discovered that channeling a warm creek along the base of a south-facing stone wall created a growing season 2 months longer than anything else in the county. Hester had written it down not because she expected to use it, but because she was a person who wrote things down. The observation of the woman in Kentucky, the principle it suggested, the question it raised about whether warm water moving through soil could function as a kind of underground heat, protecting roots from freeze, even when the air above was well below zero. She had written it down in 1904 and put it away and not thought about it again until she was sitting in a hidden valley with a warm spring running along the base of a south-facing stone wall and nothing left to lose. The work began in the second week of March. She drove stakes into the soil every 10 feet along the base of the southern wall, beginning at the point where the warm spring ran closest to the rock face. Each morning she checked them. Within 4 feet of the warm water channel, the stakes pulled free easily. At 8 feet, the ground offered resistance. At 12 feet, it was iron. She noted everything in the notebook. The exact measurements. The soil temperature where she could reach it with the thermometer. The quality of the earth color texture, moisture content. The angle of the winter sun reaching the valley floor and for how many hours each day. She was not working by intuition. She was working by method, and the method was her own, assembled from 30 years of paying attention to things that most people walked past without noticing. She started digging on the 14th of March. Using the short-handled axe and a flat piece of granite she had shaped against another rock into something approximating a spade, she carved a series of shallow channels outward from the warm spring, fanning across the valley floor in a pattern she had sketched in the notebook first. Not random, deliberate. Each channel angled to carry warm water as far from the source as possible, while maintaining enough flow to actually transfer heat to the surrounding soil. It was slow work. It was hard work. Every morning, her hands needed several minutes to open fully before she could grip the tool handles, and every evening when she stopped, her knee had swollen enough that she could feel it through the canvas wrapping. She ate more on the days she worked hardest, adjusting her rations with the same precision she brought to everything, because a person who runs out of fuel is as a person who stops. She lined each channel with stones she carried from the creek bed, flat stones chosen for surface area that would absorb the warmth of the water flowing over them and hold it. Over the tay, she packed dried grass and deadfall brush, creating an insulating layer that would trap the heat rising from below and keep it from bleeding straight up into the cold air. Drum watch from the paddock she had fenced at the eastern end of the valley using rope and stones stacked carefully between natural pillars of granite. He was philosophical about the reduction in his circumstances. He ate what she gave him, drank from the warm spring, and stood in the corner of his paddock with his tail to the wind, like a horse who has made his peace with the situation. By the end of March, she had 7 channels running, covering a rough fan shape roughly 40 feet long and 15 feet wide at the broadest point. She checked the soil temperature in the center of the fan with the thermometer and wrote down the number. 38 degrees. Not warm, but above freezing. In the last week of March at 4,000 feet in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the ground in the center of her channel system was above freezing. She planted turnip seed on the 1st of April. Then she waited, because that was the next part of the work, and it was the part that could not be hurried, and it was the hardest part for a person who had spent the last 6 weeks surviving on the fuel of forward motion. She maintained the channels. She adjusted the flow of 2 that were losing heat too quickly. She added more insulation over the 3rd channel where the soil temperature had dropped 2 degrees in a cold snap. She watched and measured and recorded and adjusted, and she waited. The first shoot appeared on the 17th of April. Pale green, barely a centimeter, pushing up through soil that had no right to be producing anything. She knelt over it for a long time. Soot sat beside her and looked at it with the respectful attention he brought to most things. Hester pressed her fist against her mouth. She held it there until the feeling passed. Then she stood up, made a note in the notebook, and went back to work. The second year was better in every material way, and harder in one way she had not anticipated. The channels had proven themselves through a winter that was genuinely brutal 12 days in January, when the temperature didn't reach zero even at midday, a February storm that dropped 30 inches of snow in the valley and more on the ridges above. The channel system, which she had expanded through the summer and fall of the first year, held. The soil above the channel stayed workable. The root vegetables she had planted in October were there in December, when she dug them solid and clean, stored in a cellar she had carved into the southern wall using the axe and the patience that had become the central fact of her daily life. She had found 4 cattle the previous summer. They had wandered into the eastern end of the valley in July, thin and unmarked, separated from whatever herd they'd come from on the open range above. No brands, no identifying marks. She had spent 3 days deciding what to do about them, going back and forth in her mind with genuine moral seriousness, and she had arrived at the conclusion that cattle without brands and without an owner who had troubled to come looking for them were cattle available to the person who could keep them alive. She kept them alive. Through that first winter and the harder second winter, she fed them from the hay she had managed to grow in the warmest section of the channel system, supplemented with dried vegetation she had gathered through the summer. They were thin by February. They were alive. By March, they were gaining weight on the early growth that pushed through the channel-warm soil, while the rest of the valley was still under snow. One of them was a young cow. By the second spring, she was producing milk. The butter came later that summer. Hester had made butter 10,000 times on the farm over 30 years, and the process was simply the process, unchanged by circumstances. What was different was the quality. The cow was eating grass grown in soil, warmed by mineral-rich spring water, and whatever that combination put into the milk, put it also into the butter. A depth and sweetness that Hester noticed the first time she tasted it and wrote about in the notebook with the careful objectivity she brought to all her observations. The second year was better. More food, more channels. A real cabin now built against the southern wall through the summer with timber she felled at the valley's edge and dragged in using drum and a rope system rigged through a granite pillar that had taken her 3 days to engineer correctly. A proper door, a window facing south, a stone fireplace that drew cleanly on the first try, which she considered one of the genuine achievements of her life. What she had not anticipated was the grief. Not for the farm, though she thought about the farm. Not even entirely for Clem, though she thought about him every day in the particular way of a person who has lived with someone so long that the absence of them is a physical alteration of every space. The grief was for the version of herself that had existed before April of 1909. The woman who had walked into Orville Pruitt's bank with a reasonable plan and been turned away. The woman who had stood in her own garden while Dexmoro told her she should go somewhere comfortable and be settled by someone else. That woman had known what she was, had known where she stood, had known her own weight in the world, even when the world was making things difficult. This woman, the one in the hidden valley, did not yet know what she was. She was still becoming it. And the process of becoming it turned out involved a loneliness so total that on certain winter nights it became indistinguishable from a kind of physical pain. She dealt with it the way she dealt with her knee. She wrapped it and worked through it and did not allow it to determine what happened the next morning. Soot helped. She was not romantic about this. She was a practical woman who understood the difference between sentimentality and fact. The fact was that the dog slept against her back every night and was there every morning when she woke, and his presence in the valley was the one constant that required nothing of her except that she continue to be there. He hunted. He watched. He moved through the valley with a quiet authority that she found over time genuinely comforting in a way that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with the simple fact of not being entirely alone. She talked to him in the evening sometimes, not the way a lonely person talks to fill silence. The way she had always talked to Drum, explaining her thinking, working through a problem out loud, because the act of forming words around an idea tested the idea's structure. She would describe what she was planning to do with the northern section of the channel system, or why she thought the third cattle pen needed to be repositioned, and Soot would regard her with his amber eyes and listen with an attention that was at minimum flattering and possibly functional. The third year was the year she stopped surviving and started producing. The channel system by the end of the third year covered nearly an acre of the valley floor. Not all of it was equally productive. The sections farthest from the primary warm spring depended more on the insulation layer than on actual heat transfer, and she had learned to manage each section differently based on its specific microclimate, making notes and adjustments with the ongoing precision of a person who understands that a system only works if you keep paying attention to it. But the acre produced turnips, carrots, potatoes, kale, winter onions, late brassicas that had no business being harvested in December and were harvested in December. Root vegetables stored in 3 cellars carved into the southern wall, each maintained at a temperature she had calibrated by adjusting the airflow through small stone vents she had built into the cellar doors. She had 6 cattle now. 2 more strays acquired the previous summer, again unmarked, again unclaimed. She had built a proper stone pen against the eastern cliff face where the warm spring kept the ground soft enough that she could grow a sustained crop of fodder grass through the winter. The cattle were healthy in a way that should not have been possible at this elevation in this season. They were fat. The milk production from the 2 cows was more than she needed. The surplus butter she stored in the coolest section of the main cellar, wrapped in cheesecloth, packed in pine crates she had constructed herself from timber she had split and shaped over the winter evenings. It was good butter. She knew this the way she knew all things by direct observation without sentimentality. She had tasted butter from the best dairies in the valley in better years, and this was better than that. She was not ready to go back to Grover Mill. She had reasons beyond caution. The valley was not yet what it needed to be. She could still see the places where a hard winter could undo what she'd built, the vulnerabilities that another season or 2 of work would close. And she was still in some ways she couldn't entirely articulate, not finished with the becoming, not finished understanding what she had built and what it meant and who she was inside it. But in the late winter of 1912, 3 years into the mountains, an event arrived that she had not planned for. She heard the horse 4 days before she saw the rider. Heard it, then found the tracks on the 5th morning, shod horse coming from the south, following the main creek upward. Someone was looking for the valley. Or looking for her. The distinction mattered. She did not panic. Panic was the response of a person who has no plan, and Hester had spent 3 years building a plan into the landscape itself. The western entrance to the valley was invisible from any trail or ridgeline a casual traveler might use. She had added to its natural concealment over the years, brush piled against the boulder faces, a screen of young alder planted in soil she had broken up 2 winters ago, along the approach position to guide an unfamiliar eye past the actual entrance and toward a dead-end ravine 40 yards to the south. She waited. On the 5th day, Fenwick Cass rode into the dead-end ravine and stopped. He sat his horse and looked at the walls closing in around him and the blank granite at the end of the ravine and the nothing that was there. He was a young man, 26, 27, with a deputy's badge on his coat and the careful eyes of someone who has been told to find something and is starting to accept that he may not find it. Hester stepped out of the tree line behind him. She had thought carefully about how to handle this. She had thought about it for 4 days, lying awake in the cabin, while soot breezed steadily against her leg, working through every variation and its consequences. She had arrived at a strategy that used the one weapon she possessed that Fenwick Cass would never think to defend against. She was an old woman. In 1912 in rural Virginia, an old woman alone in the mountains was either dead or harmless. And since she was visibly not dead, the harmless conclusion followed automatically in the minds of men like Fenwick Cass. It was the same assumption that had let Lum Pickett walk away with a basket of mushrooms and a story about a strange old woman. The same assumption that Sheriff Morrow had expressed so clearly on the morning he took her farm, in the casual certainty that someone her age and her sex and her circumstance required management rather than reckoning. She had spent 3 years being furious about that assumption. She had also spent 3 years understanding that it was the most useful tool she possessed. She walked out of the trees carrying a basket of dried herbs and moving with the careful gait of someone whose knee genuinely hurt, which was not a performance. She let herself look older than she felt, let her shoulders round slightly. Let the tiredness of 66 years settle into her face in the way it wanted to settle when she was not actively holding it back. Fenwick Cass turned his horse and stared at her. "Lord," he said, "you're real." "Last I checked," she said. He explained with the halting courtesy of a young man in an awkward situation that the sheriff had sent him, that there had been talk in Grover Mill about a woman living in the mountains, that people had been asking questions. He did not say what questions, and she did not ask. She asked him if he was hungry. He was. She gave him dried venison and a piece of the hard cheese she had learned to make from the second cow's milk, and she sat with him on a flat rock beside the main creek and answered the questions he asked and did not answer the ones he didn't think to ask, which were the important ones. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. He asked where she was living. She waved vaguely at the ridge line above them, the gesture of someone whose situation is too complicated to explain, and he accepted it. He asked if she needed anything from town. She said she did not. He ate the cheese with the focused appreciation of a man who has been living on trail food for several days, and he looked out at the creek, and after a while he said something she had not expected. "My wife is sick," he said. "Chest sickness started last fall. The doctor says she needs to keep her strength up. He says fresh vegetables would help if we could get them." He paused. "I don't suppose you'd know anything about growing vegetables at this time of year." Hester looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about Clem, about the slow, terrible weight of a chest sickness working through a person you loved while you sat beside them and could not stop it, about what it meant to have someone offer you something useful at the moment when useful was exactly what you needed. She made a decision. She told him about the warm spring, not the valley's location, not anything that would let him find it again without her help, but the principle, the channeled water, the soil temperature, the protected growing. She told him enough that he understood it was real, and she told him what to look for on his own property, a south-facing slope, any source of running water, any place where the ground stayed soft longer than it should. She watched his face change as he understood what she was describing. The shift from polite attention to genuine interest, the moment when an idea lands and takes root. "You'd tell me this," he said, "even though Morrow sent me out here to find you." "I'm telling you this," she said, "because your wife is sick and you love her. That's a sufficient reason." He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her, like they were trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had expected. Then he nodded once with the seriousness of a man making a commitment. "I won't say where you are," he said. "I'll tell him I didn't find anything." "I know you will," she said. And she did know. She had spent 66 years reading people, and Fenwick Cass was not a complicated man. He was a decent one, which was rare and more valuable. She gave him a sack of dried kale to take home for his wife. He took it with both hands carefully like something fragile. He rode south. She watched him go. Then she walked back to the valley entrance, moved 2 branches she had positioned as markers, and went home through the gap in the boulders that was invisible from 10 feet away if you didn't know exactly where to look. Soot was waiting inside the entrance, sitting in the middle of the path. She crouched beside him, which cost her something from the bad knee. She held his heavy head in both her cracked hands and looked into the amber eyes. "We have an ally," she said. "Our first one." Soot regarded her with calm approval. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin, and she followed him in, out of the cold. She had a third year of building still ahead of her, then a fourth. And then when the world outside the valley had finished doing what it was going to do, she would be ready. She did not know yet what form the readiness would take, but she had learned in the 3 years since she pressed her fist against her mouth over the first green shoot that the work itself knew. You built what needed to be built. You paid attention to what the land was telling you. You wrote it down. You adjusted. You kept going. She went inside and lit the lamp and opened the notebook to a fresh page. Outside, the warm spring ran through its channels, and the February ground stayed soft, and the cattle shifted in their pen, and Drum stood in his paddock, breathing white clouds into the dark mountain air. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. Then she trimmed it and wrote some more. The winter of 1914 into 1915 was the kind that people in the Blue Ridge Mountains would talk about for the rest of their lives, and not fondly. It started wrong in the summer. The rains that were supposed to come in June came in April instead, too early, and too concentrated, washing topsoil off hillsides that hadn't been properly managed, flooding creek bottoms, drowning early plantings. Then June arrived, and the rain stopped entirely. July was a furnace. August was worse. The pasture grass in the Grover Mill Valley turned brown by the middle of the month and stayed brown, and the cattle that had been grazing on it all summer went into fall thin and poorly conditioned, burning reserves they would desperately need when the cold came. The cold came in November, not gradually the way cold usually negotiates its arrival in Virginia, a few hard frosts a week of gray skies, the slow understanding that summer is finished. It came all at once, a hard Arctic front that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 18 hours and didn't recover. December was brutal. January was historic. In Grover Mill, people burned furniture in February. Hester knew none of the specific details from inside her valley. What she knew from observation, the depth of the snow on the ridges above the duration of the cold spells as measured by her thermometer, the behavior of the birds that wintered in the valley walls. She knew it was bad outside. She did not know yet how bad. Inside the valley, the channel system held. She had spent the previous 3 summers extending and reinforcing what she had built, closing the vulnerabilities she had identified, layering redundancy into the most critical sections. The main channels now ran across nearly an acre of valley floor, feeding a network of secondary channels she had added in the 3rd and 4th years as she refined her understanding of how the warm water moved heat through soil and how to maximize that movement against the specific patterns of cold that the valley experienced. She had 7 cattle now. 3 of them were producing milk. The hay crop from the channel warm section of the valley floor was not enough to fully feed 7 cattle through a winter like this one, and she had known going in that she would need to supplement. She had prepared for it dried fodder stored in the largest of the 3 cellars, rationed carefully from November onward. She watched the stores with the same precision she brought to everything, adjusting daily rations against the duration of the cold, recalculating as each week passed. The cattle were thin by February. They were alive. The garden produced through December and into January. She harvested kale in the first week of February, cutting it in the early morning, while the temperature above the channels was 23 degrees, and the temperature at root level where the channel warmth held was 37. She stood in the garden in the blue pre-dawn dark with frozen breath in a basket over her arm, cutting kale that had no business being there, and she thought about the people in the valley below. She had been thinking about them since December. This was not a simple thing. 6 years had passed since she had walked out of Grover Mill with Drum and Soot and a bad knee and nothing else, and in those 6 years, the people of that town had not once thought about her in any way that helped her. Orville Pruitt had taken her land through a system designed to take it. Sheriff Dex Morrow had ridden out with his deputies and his piece of stamped paper and told her she should go be settled somewhere comfortable. Birch Geary had sent his regrets through a hired hand on the day she buried her husband. The town had watched her leave and assumed the story was finished and turned back to its own business. She did not owe those people anything. She had examined this question with the same honest thoroughness she brought to all questions, and she had arrived at that conclusion cleanly and without self-deception. But she also had more food than she could eat, And she had it because she had figured something out that other people hadn't figured out, and the people in the valley below were suffering in part because they hadn't figured it out. And Hester Dodd had not spent 30 years building knowledge in a notebook in order to watch it stay in a notebook while people went hungry 2,000 feet below her. There was a difference between what she owed and what she chose to do. She had spent 69 years learning that difference, and she intended to honor it. In the first week of March, when the temperature finally climbed above zero and held there for 3 consecutive days, she began loading the mule. She had acquired the mule the previous summer from a Melungeon trader who came through the upper ridges every year with tools and leather goods and a patient willingness to barter. She had traded a dressed calf and 6 pounds of butters for a solid gray mule of about 8 years with a practical temperament and a broad back well suited to carrying things down mountains. She had named him Warrant for reasons she didn't explain to anyone because there was no one to explain them to. She loaded Warrant over 2 days. Butter 14 pounds of it wrapped in cheesecloth and packed in pine crates. Potatoes 40 pounds stored through the winter in the root cellar at a steady 44 degrees, firm and clean. Eggs 3 dozen packed in dried grass inside a wooden box she had built specifically for transport. Dried beef 8 pounds. 8. Dried kale, a bundle as thick as her arm. Winter onions braided in ropes of 12-6 ropes. She stood back and looked at the loaded mule and did the arithmetic she had been doing in her head for 2 weeks. This was more than she needed to get through the rest of the winter and into spring planting. This was surplus, real surplus, the kind that justified the entire enterprise of the last 6 years. Drum was too old for the mountain trails, now 17 years old, and stiff in the cold mornings, his working days behind him. He watched from his paddock with the philosophical calm of an elderly horse who has accepted his circumstances. She had built the paddock to keep him comfortable in his retirement, and he seemed to appreciate the gesture, or at least to not object to it. She saddled the younger horse she had acquired in the 4th year, a compact gray mare she called Flint, and loaded the last of the supply crates onto Warrant's back and tied them down with the careful double hitching she had learned from watching Clem pack horses in what felt like another lifetime. Soot was at the valley entrance when she led the animals through the boulder gap. He was 11 years old, gray around the muzzle, moving with the deliberate economy of a dog who had learned not to waste anything on urgency. He still hunted. He still slept against her back every night with the same steady warmth he had provided since the first frozen February in the mountains. He looked up at her with his amber eyes and waited. "We're going down," she told him. He turned and walked out ahead of her onto the mountain trail, already knowing the direction, already moving with purpose. She followed him, leading Flint and Warrant, and the valley closed behind them. The boulder gap invisible from 10 feet away, the warm spring still running inside the channel, still moving. Heat through the soil, the cattle still in their pen against the eastern wall. It would be there when she came back. The trail down took most of the morning. Her knee handled it in the way her knee handled everything now, with a grumbling, grinding persistence that was simply the background noise of her days, the price of having used a body hard for 69 years in terrain that was not gentle. She stopped twice to rest it, not from defeat, but from the same practical calculation she applied to everything. You do not run a horse into the ground on a day when you need it to carry things home. She came into Grover Mill from the North Road at midday. The town looked diminished. That was the first thing she noticed. Not physically damaged, not ruined, but pressed down somehow. The way a person looks after a long illness, still standing, but carrying the evidence of what it had cost. The main street was quiet in the way of a place where people have been conserving energy for months. 2 horses at the hitching post outside Tate's store. A wagon with a broken wheel leaning against the livery wall. Smoke from 3 chimneys. She rode Flint to the front of Orson Tate's general store and dismounted and tied both animals at the post. Soot sat beside the door without being told. She unloaded the crates herself one at a time, carrying each one through the door of the store and setting it on the counter. Tate watched her on the first trip with his mouth open. He watched her on the second trip with his hands on the counter. By the third trip, he had come around from behind the counter and was holding the door. "Mrs. Dodd," he said. "Lord Almighty, Hester Dodd." She set the last crate on the counter and straightened up, which took a moment. "Ned," she said, then Orson. "Forgive me." She had not spoken to another person since Fenwick Cast 3 years ago. The name had come out wrong before the right one arrived. Tate didn't notice. He was staring at the crates, at the butter, at the potatoes, at the eggs packed in their wooden box. His face was doing something complicated. "I don't want money," she said. "I don't want credit. If people need it, it's theirs." Tate looked at her. He was a practical man, not given to demonstrative emotion, but something was working behind his eyes that was not entirely practical. He looked at the food on his counter, and he looked at her worn coat, and her cracked hands, and her white hair, and her bad knee, and the dog sitting outside his door. He said, "I'll need to get word out." "Get word out," she said. She stepped back from the counter and stood against the far wall and waited. She was not in a hurry. She had nowhere else to be. Word traveled through Grover Mill in the particular way of a small town where everyone knows which houses are connected to which and who talks to whom. In 40 minutes, there were 7 people in Tate's store. In an hour, there were 14. They came with the quiet urgency of people who have been cold and short and reduced and are confronting something unexpected. They looked at the food on the counter, and they looked at the old woman standing against the wall with her dog outside the door, and their expressions moved through surprise and confusion and something that in several cases became something else, something harder to name. She watched them take what they needed. She watched a woman she half recognized put 6 potatoes carefully in her basket and then put 2 back, and Hester said from across the room, "Take the 6," and the woman looked at her and took the 6. She was watching a young mother wrap the dried kale in her shawl when she became aware of a presence near the door that altered the quality of the air in the room. She looked up. Orville Pruitt was standing just inside the entrance. He had aged badly. The thin, careful man who had folded his hands on his desk and explained to her about the bank's obligations had been replaced by something hollowed out. His coat was clean, but worn at the cuffs. He was thinner than thin, the way a man gets when the thinness has been going on long enough to become structural. His bank had closed in January. She had heard this from Fenwick Cass's wife, who had passed a message through the trader the previous fall. Pruitt had lost the bank and apparently everything with it. He stood in the doorway and looked at Hester across the room full of people. She looked back at him. The room went somewhat quiet in the way rooms do when 2 people lock eyes and everyone else can feel the weight of what's between them. She reached to the counter beside her. She picked up a package of butter, 1 pound wrapped in cheesecloth, tied with a piece of twine. She walked across the room toward him. The people between them made space without being asked. She held the butter out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. His jaw worked once. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the butter didn't say better. She had thought for 6 years about what she would feel in a moment like this, whether it would be satisfaction or anger or grief or some combination she couldn't predict. What she actually felt was something quieter and more final than any of those things. The feeling of a debt discharged not by him but by time and circumstance and the particular arithmetic of how things actually work out in the world. He took the butter with both hands. He couldn't look at her. She turned and walked back to her position against the wall. Birch Geary found her outside the store an hour later loading the empty crates onto Warrant's back for the return trip. He was bigger than she remembered, or maybe just older, the mass of a working man settling differently past 60. His beard was going gray. He was holding his hat with both hands in front of him, which was something she had never seen Birch Geary do. He had lost 55 cattle. He told her this with the directness of a man reciting a number that he had said to himself enough times that it no longer broke him to say it, though it had broken him at some point. "Every family in the Eastern Valley lost stock," he said. "The Hendersons lost everything. Frank Pulliam lost everything. I've got 11 head left out of 66. "I'm sorry for it," Hester said. And she was. She was sorry for the cattle and sorry for the families and sorry for the reality that all of this might have been different if the knowledge she had been building in the mountains had been available to them before this winter rather than after it. That was a thought she had turned over many times and reached no comfortable conclusion about. Birch worked his jaw. He looked at the empty crates on the mule's back, and he looked at Hester with her white hair and her bad knee and her 6 years of mountain living written into every line of her. "I said things about you," he said, "when you first went up there. I said you were probably stealing, that you'd lost your mind." He stopped. "I was wrong to say it, and I'm telling you so." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the hired hand he had sent to her husband's funeral with his regrets. She thought about what it cost a man like Birch Geary to stand in a street with his hat in both hands and say he had been wrong. "You were wrong," she said, "and you've said so. That's sufficient." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. "I don't know how you did what you did up there," he said, "but I lost 55 head this winter, and you came down with enough food to feed this town for 2 weeks. If there's something to be learned from that, I want to learn it." She finished tying the last rope on Warren's pack. She turned and regarded Birch Geary with the steady assessment of a woman who has spent 6 years learning which calculations matter and which don't. "Come to the mountain," she said. "Come willing to work and willing to listen. Those are the only conditions." He came the next morning. 3 days in the valley changed Birch Geary in the way that seeing something impossible and real changes a person. Not his fundamental character, he was still large and direct and constitutionally opposed to changing his mind quickly about anything. But something behind his eyes had shifted the way a compass shifts when it finds north. He stood in the garden on the morning of the second day and watched Hester dig carrots from ground that was by any reasonable measure not supposed to have carrots in it. He watched her lay them out on the flat stones she used as a sorting surface, clean and firm orange and real, while the dough that had fallen overnight lay an inch deep on the ground 6 feet away from where he was standing. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How?" She showed him, not in the way of a teacher with a lesson prepared, but in the way she had learned from 30 years of figuring things out herself by showing him the thing, and then showing him the reason for the thing, and then making him do the thing while she watched and corrected. She showed him how to read a hillside for the signs of underground water, how the soil color changed near a subsurface flow, how certain plants preferred those conditions, how to follow the vegetation to the source. She showed him how to test soil temperature and what the numbers meant for planting. She showed him how to construct a channel and line it with flat stone and insulate it with organic material and angle it for maximum flow. She put his hands in the soil beside the warm spring, and she put his hands in the soil 8 feet from the warm spring, and she made him feel the difference. On the third morning before he left, they sat on the flat rock outside the cabin with cups of the bitter coffee she allowed herself once a day, and he asked her the question she had been expecting. "Why are you showing me this?" She turned her cup in her hands. The morning light was coming over the eastern wall of the valley, catching the steam rising from the channels below. "Because it doesn't do anyone any good sitting up here," she said. "You could have come down years ago, sold this butter years ago, made a business of it." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't ready. Because I wasn't ready." She looked out over the valley, the channels and the garden and the cattle pen and the stone walls she had built over 6 years with her own hands. "You can't share knowledge you haven't finished building." "I had to finish building it first." Birch drank his coffee. He was a man who processed things slowly and thoroughly, which was, she had concluded, actually a virtue in the right circumstances. "Morrow is retired," he said. "Moved to Roanoke last year." "I know. Pruitt lost everything. The bank, the house, most of it." "I know that too. Your land, the Dodd farm, changed hands twice after Prentice Vale. It's sitting empty now. Nobody's been able to make it work." He paused. "You could probably get it back for what Clem owed if you wanted it." She thought about the farm, about the creek she had carried water from for 30 years, about the bedroom where Clem had died, and the garden she had built, and the root cellar she had lined with her own hands. About the morning Morrow had ridden out with his deputies and his piece of stamped paper and told her she should go somewhere comfortable. "That land taught me what could be taken," she said. "The mountain taught me what couldn't." She set down her cup. "I'll stay on the mountain." Birch nodded slowly with the gravity of a man who has just understood something that cannot be ununderstood. He went home. He built his first warming channel that summer, following her instructions, with the stubbornness he brought to everything, which turned out to be exactly the right temperament for the work. In December of that year, he harvested turnips. His neighbor who had not visited Hester lost his remaining cattle to the following January. They came from all over the Eastern Valley through 1915 and into 1916. Some came out of desperation. The die-up had bankrupted half the ranchers in the county, and people were looking for any edge that might keep them alive through the next bad winter. Some came out of curiosity. A few came to prove that whatever Hester was doing couldn't work on their land, and they left having proven the opposite. The only condition was the one she had given Birch. Come willing to work. Come willing to listen. 18 people learned from Hester in those 2 years. She did not advertise. She did not seek anyone out. She let it be known through Tate's store that anyone who wanted to learn was welcome to make the ride, and she let the people who had already come do the talking, which they did with the converted enthusiasm of people who have seen something they cannot stop thinking about. She taught them the way she had taught herself, by doing, by showing, by putting their hands in the dirt and making them feel the difference between frozen ground and warm ground, between soil that was olive and soil that had gone dormant. She taught them to read their own land with the particular attention that most people reserve for things they considered more important than dirt, and she showed them case by case that nothing was more important than dirt. Fenwick Cass came in the spring of 1915 with his wife, who had recovered from her chest sickness and was now strong enough to make the mountain ride. His wife, a small, observant woman named Della, spent 4 days in the valley and left with a notebook of her own filled with observations in handwriting so small and precise, it reminded Hester of someone she couldn't quite place. Fenwick told her privately that Morrow had been asking about her even after his retirement, that the old sheriff had made inquiries through the county clerk about the status of the Dodd land, that whatever he had expected to find when he sent Fenwick into the mountains in 1912, he had apparently not found satisfaction in the answer that came back. "Does he know?" Hester asked. "Not from me," Fenwick said. "Not from Della. Not from anyone who's been up here." She nodded. She appreciated this more than she said. Not everyone had a warm spring. She had known from the beginning that the specific conditions of her valley were unusual, and she had spent years thinking about how to translate its principles into something applicable to more ordinary terrain. The answer she had arrived at was that warm springs were exceptional, but the principle was not. Any running water properly channeled and insulated created a microclimate. Cold water was less forgiving than warm water, required more insulation, produced more modest results. But modest results were still results. She showed Garland Hicks, a farmer from the northern end of the county, with only a small cold water creek and a south-facing slope, how to build a channel system using triple insulation that could gain him 4 weeks of growing season at either end of the year. 4 weeks in the mathematics of feeding a family through a Virginia winter was the difference between making it and not. Hicks built the system that fall, and that winter, his family ate fresh vegetables in November that they had never eaten in November before. He sent a written note to Tate's store addressed to Mrs. Hester Dodd with one line in it, "Thank you." She put it in the notebook at the back behind the last page of observations and left it there. The reporter arrived in the spring of 1917 on a roan horse with a leather satchel and the slightly unfocused energy of a young man who has been given an assignment he suspects might be more interesting than he initially thought. His name was Calvin Pruitt. He was 24 years old, and he was Orville Pruitt's nephew, which was a fact that struck Hester as the kind of symmetry that the world produced when it was paying attention to itself. He worked for the Roanoke Times and had been sent to the Blue Ridge to write about agricultural developments in the mountain communities. A general interest piece, his editor's idea, the kind of story that got printed in the back pages and read by farmers on Sunday mornings. Birch Geary had directed him to Hester. She met him at the valley entrance the way she met all visitors, and she walked him in through the boulder gap and watched his face when the valley opened up before him. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the entrance and looked at the channels running across the valley floor with their thin lines of rising mist, at the garden beds dark and productive against the warming earth, at the cattle fat in their stone pen, at the cabin built into the southern wall with the smoke rising straight up in the still morning air. "This is real," he said, not as a question. "Last I checked," Hester said, "he spent 2 days in the valley. He had a reporter's notebook, and he filled it with the careful detail of someone who understands that the specific, accurate fact is worth more than any number of generalities. He measured things. He asked questions. He was respectful in the way of a young man who has been raised with manners and has also just encountered something that has reset his sense of what requires respect." On the evening of the second day, sitting outside the cabin with the last light going gold on the eastern wall, he asked her what she wanted the people to know about what she had built. She thought about this for a while. Soot was lying across her feet, which was his customary position in the evenings now that his joints had stiffened. The warmth of him moved up through her boots. "Tell them it's not magic," she said. "Tell them it's attention. Most land will do more than people let it because most people look at their land and see what it isn't instead of what it is. She was quiet for a moment. Tell them about the notebook. That the most important tool I had up here was the habit of writing things down and going back and reading what I'd written and asking whether I still agreed with it. He wrote all of this down. He wrote down more than she said, filling in the context she provided by implication rather than statement. The article appeared in the Roanoke Times in April of 1917. She read it at Tate's store on a Wednesday morning, standing at the counter with Tate watching her from the other side, her coffee cooling beside her. It was a good article. It was accurate in its facts and generous in its framing, and it contained one paragraph that she read twice slowly about a woman who had been dispossessed of her land in 1909 and had gone into the mountains with nothing and had built over the course of 6 years something that had fed a community and preserved it through its worst winter in living memory. The paragraph did not name the bank. It did not name the sheriff. It did not need to. Her name was in the paper for the first time in 8 years. She thought about Dex Morrow reading that article in his retirement in Roanoke, which was where Calvin Pruitt's paper was published and distributed. She thought about him reading her name and reading what she had done and what it meant. She allowed herself that thought for approximately 30 seconds. Then she finished her coffee and loaded her supplies onto Warrant's back and headed home. She was 71 years old in the spring of 1917. And she did not feel it in the way that 71 sounded, though she felt it in the way of things that had been used hard and maintained carefully. The knee was what it was. The hands were what they were. The white hair she had stopped thinking about years ago. What she felt most mornings was the particular quality of attention that the valley required, and that she had been giving it for 8 years, the daily circuit of the channels, the garden, the cattle pen, the spring itself, reading each element for the small signs that required response. It was not a diminished life. It was a specific one. It had been built from nothing, from a bad knee and a good notebook and a Don who had appeared at the right moment and never left, and it had become what it was through nothing more or less miraculous than sustained honest attention over a long time. On an evening in late April, she sat on the porch steps with the notebook open in her lap. Soot lay at her feet, gray-muzzled, slower now, but present, always present. She had been thinking about him lately with the particular tenderness of someone who understands they are watching something in its last good years and who intends to see every day of it clearly. The warming channels glowed faintly in the dusk below, the thin mist rising from the ground like breath. The garden beyond them was dark and rich. Even now, even in the lingering cold of a Virginia mountain spring, the things she had planted were doing what things do when the conditions are right. She opened the notebook, not to read it. She knew every page. She opened it because it was the work, and the work was the thing, and the thing continued. She found a blank page near the back. She dated it, April 22nd, 1917. She wrote, "Knowledge isn't like gold. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger." She had written versions of this before in different years, in different words. She wrote it again because it remained true, and because truth bears repetition, and because somewhere in the valley below, in the homes of 18 families who had come to her willing to work and willing to listen, the channels were running and the ground was warm, and the things planted in it were doing what they were supposed to do. She did not think about what had been taken from her. Not tonight, not often anymore. What had been taken was fixed and done, and receding the way a storm recedes, real, while it happened, visible on the horizon for a time, eventually just weather, eventually just the way things had gone. What had been built was here, was present, was running through channels in the earth and rising in green rows in the garden and expressed in the notebooks of women she had taught, who were now teaching their neighbors. It was not hers in the way the farm had been hers, documented and filed, and therefore vulnerable. It was hers the way the valley was hers, because she was in it, because she had built it, because it existed in the world as the accumulated result of her attention and her stubbornness, and her refusal to let what could be taken define what could be made. Soot shifted against her feet. She looked down at him. His great-granddaughter, a young black female with the same amber eyes and the same uncanny composure, was asleep on the porch behind her. Hester had named her Ash for no reason she could fully explain, and no reason that required explanation. She set down the notebook. She stood slowly with the assistance of the porch rail, the way she had learned to stand after long periods of sitting. Her knee registered its usual complaint and was noted and disregarded. She walked down the porch steps and into the valley. The channels were moving below her in the evening quiet. The mist rose thin and steady from the warm ground. The cattle shifted in their pen with the soft sounds of comfortable animals in adequate shelter. Above the granite walls, the first stars were appearing in the deep blue of the spring sky. She walked the circuit she walked every evening. The main channel, the secondary channels, the garden, the spring. She walked it with her hands open at her sides, not reaching for anything, not holding anything, just present in the air of the place that she had chosen and that had chosen her back. She thought about Clem. She thought about him in the easy way she had learned to think about him, not with the acute missing of the early years, but with the settled companionship of a person who remains real in the mind of someone who loved them. He would have understood this valley. He would have walked this same circuit with her in the evenings and asked good practical questions and not said anything unnecessary. She thought about the 18 families, about Birch Geary's first turnips in December, about Delicass's notebook with its small, precise handwriting, about the rancher in the northern county who had written one line on a piece of paper. Thank you. She thought about what her notebook said, knowledge gets bigger when you share it. She thought it was probably true of most things worth having. The last light left the top of the eastern wall. The valley settled into its particular darkness of a contained place that holds warmth longer than the open air, the darkness of somewhere that has been tended. The spring ran in the quiet. The cattle breathed. An owl spoke once from the rim rock above, and then was silent. Hester Dodd stood in the center of her valley with the warm ground under her feet and the cold stars above, and the work of 8 years surrounding her on every side. Not triumph. She had never wanted triumph. What she had wanted was simpler and harder than that, and it had built it from bad terrain and bad luck, and a body that ached in the cold, and a mind that would not stop working, and a notebook and a black day, and the stubborn patient insistence that what could be learned could be applied, and what could be applied could be shared, and what could be shared could not be taken. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. Ash rose from the porch and came to meet her, amber eyes catching the last of the light, and fell into step beside her without a sound. Together they went inside. The notebook was on the table where she had left it. The lamp needed lighting. There was work to do in the morning, and the morning would come, and she would be ready for it. She always was.